I'm Andrew Beer. I'm the Executive Dean of UniSA Business, and I have the pleasure of being the facilitator today. I think the key point to understand is that my role is to be as invisible as possible and to facilitate and bring forward as much discussion for the benefit of every person in this room and in this conference today. I'd like to invite the panellists to come up. And our panellists today are Liz Thomas, Chair of the Australian Co-operative Housing Alliance and CEO of CEHL, Shane Sylvanspring, Managing Director, Planning Regenerative Communities, and Dr. Sidsel Grimstad, a cooperative researcher, Griffith University. This is a remarkably well-qualified group and a remarkably well-equipped group to lead this discussion today. The format of our discussion will be each of the panellists will be invited to come up here and give a 10-minute presentation, and then at the end we will have a discussion which I'll lead, and we'll ask for questions using Slido, which will be voted on and nominated, and we'll use that to really take us to an important point in terms of our understanding of the role of cooperative housing in Australia today. I just thought I'd provide a very brief piece of background. Australian housing is in crisis. The affordability crisis has never been more acute since the Second World War, 80 years, and it is gathering pace across a number of dimensions. So whatever way we want to look at it, whether we're looking at house prices or whether we're looking at rents, it is clearly escalating towards a circumstance that is unacceptable. These data emphasise that we need new solutions for the 21st century for housing in this country. And one of the great opportunities I see is the cooperatives, which have provided solutions in the past, as was pointed out in the last session, but also offer the prospect of new solutions of benefit to all Australians. And that is the purpose of this session, to begin to tease out those issues and hear about the pathways forward our panellists have identified and begin to act upon. So with that, I now invite Liz Thomas to come and speak to us. Over to you.
That's Sidsel's. It's the wrong presentation. Just hum amongst yourselves for a little moment. That's me. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. On behalf of my Australian Co-operative Housing Alliance colleagues, I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and the lands on which all of our cooperative houses across Australia are owned and delivered, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I began my career on the dark side. I was in the financial services sector, and after 20 years or so doing that, in 2012 I saw the light and joined the community housing sector. And then in 2021, I saw the brighter light and joined the community housing sector. And I can only say I wish I'd discovered it 30 years ago, because it really is an exciting opportunity for us to rethink the Australian housing paradigm. And today I'm going to share a little bit about how we're delivering cooperative housing across Australia and the opportunities we see to develop that. The Australian Co-operative Housing Alliance are rental housing cooperative providers delivering co-op housing across Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. We know that co-op housing is a proven concept internationally and in Australia. In Australia, it represents less than 1% of all social housing stock. In Victoria, that's closer to 3%, but it's still well below what we see in Europe of up to 20 and 25% of all housing stock being co-op housing stock. The important thing to state is that it's a proven concept. While it's not well known in Australia, co-op housing has been delivered in our country for decades, and it's a proven concept known to work and known to deliver affordability, security and agency over housing. An agency, when we talk about co-op housing members, is more than a sausage sizzle and a can of fizz when we talk about renter engagement. People have actual power and decision-making influence over how their housing is managed. It's a renter-empowered and community-led housing model, and yet we still know very little about it in Australia. Just wanted to start by talking a little bit about common equity housing in Victoria. Tomorrow at the workshop that Nick will be facilitating, you'll have a chance to learn more about Common Equity New South Wales and the United Housing, one of the independent housing co-ops in Victoria. But by way of common equity housing in Victoria has operated for almost 40 years now. We currently manage over 2,000 properties across Victoria in regional, rural and metro Victoria. We have, I'm just going to move over here. That housing is managed primarily by 90 independent housing cooperatives. The median age of people living in the co-ops is 44 years. The average length of tenure is 11 years. We have one co-op member who has lived in her co-op property for over 40 years. And our total asset base across Victoria is about $1.2 billion. So in Australian company terms, we're a medium-sized business delivering a really important housing asset across Victoria. The other point is that the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council has already recognised where co-op housing fits in between private rental and home ownership. In Australia at the moment, if you don't qualify for public housing and you aren't able to access home ownership, private rental is the market that's left for you. And we know the Grattan Institute released a report a couple of weeks ago that 70% of older Australians in the private rental market, because they're not eligible for public housing and they can't afford to own their own home, or have lost the home they have once owned, which is an important factor, are living in poverty simply to pay private rent in the private rental market. And yet a 2022 Ahuri study indicated that for older Australians unable to own their own home, co-op housing is their preferred model of rental. So the information is already there. What we're looking for are opportunities to increase and grow the supply of affordable housing. What that's going to take, though, is a paradigm shift in housing, and to us to look at how does co-op housing actually work. I think it's been referred to a few times today. There's not a great understanding of co-ops. There's even a lesser understanding of how co-op housing works and why it's not public housing or community housing. Or I know within the broader community housing sector, we're kind of seen as an oddity that operates at the fringes and no one quite understands how we do it. I wanted to explain, this is how the common equity housing model in Victoria works. A co-op member joins a housing co-op. That housing co-op has a board. The board is usually comprised of a number of roles, including a maintenance director, a treasurer, secretary, a chair, a tenancy officer. And though that co-op head leases their properties in perpetuity from common equity, who holds title to those properties. The common equity board is made up of 5 independent technical directors. Currently our skills audit informed the selection of those directors, and we have legal skills, a former politician who understands the machinations of government and how that works, 2 people with property development expertise, and a lawyer and an accountant. So that's a really important complement to the 5 directors on the Board of Governance that are elected by the co-op. And that is where the co-op members have a real say in how that $1.2 billion portfolio is developed and delivered through the common equity housing. The corporate entity negotiates the growth and funding of the portfolio. We coordinate the HAF applications, the big housing build in Victoria applications, and we negotiate things like insurance premiums. We negotiate advocacy for co-ops and promotion of the co-ops, and we undertake the capital works on the property. The co-ops are responsible for the responsive maintenance on the property, so things like painting, carpets, gardening, preparing properties for rental. They select the tenants that live in the property. The cost of the model, how we deliver it financially, is the co-op collects the rent. Rent is set, why it's affordable, it's set as a percentage of income. 25% of household income is the minimum rent that's assessed up to the market rent of the property. And that's an important differential in the common equity model. When people join, they join on the income eligibility for public housing, which is just under $70,000 per annum household income at the moment. But as their income increases, so does their rent, but they maintain security of their housing. They don't lose their housing once, ironically, they have the economic stability and are able to return to the workforce. That's the irony in some housing models. As your income increases, your housing is at risk. And so there's not a whole lot of incentive for actually returning to the workforce. What happens at common equity? At the moment, 22% of our renters pay market rent. To give you some context, last year we made a profit of $2.3 million. $2 million of that came from the market rent that was payable by the 22% of renters currently paying that market rent. That, in fact, cross-subsidises the operation of the business. So it's actually a commercially viable and financially sustainable model. So the benefits to, going down the other side of that diagram, the benefit to the co-op is that the co-op has influence in how their property portfolio is managed. Each co-op has a business-to-business partnership agreement with common equity. I can't say, right, we want to develop the properties we currently hold in Metro Geelong and sell up there and go and invest in Metro Melbourne, because the properties are leased in perpetuity, the co-op, that needs to be negotiated. So there's real power in the rental housing cooperatives' interaction and relationship with common equity. The benefit to the members living in the housing is security of tenure and affordable rent. So the chair of our board, as an example, when she joined her co-op, she had unexpectedly found herself as a sole supporting parent and with limited career opportunities. She returned to nursing. She now has an MBA and is a nurse educator and has been paying market rent on her property of around $600 a week for the past probably about 7 to 10 years. She's now reaching that point of vulnerability for women though. She's just over 55. What she knows though is she retires, she stays in the same house, but her rent starts to decline. It's a model that works. I'm really tired of hearing it's a best kept secret. We need to be raising the roof about just how well it works. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was fantastic. Shane, over to you.
Hi everyone. Can you raise this a little bit? Hi everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I came to Sydney last night and I was a bit dazzled. I don't think I've been in a city for a few years, so I was just like, what's going on? I'm here to talk about land sharing co-ops. I'm pretty new to the co-op world. I'm a town planner in background and I've been involved in intentional communities, the Global Eco Village Network, and I've created a couple of communities in the last 10 years. I created one 5 years ago with a company, and then there was a big need in our area for people wanting to live on the land. And of course, the Northern Rivers is a well-known area for this. And with my skills, I'm like, okay, I'll create one because there's such a need and groups of people coming to me. And that's when I discovered co-ops, even though I lived in a co-op. I wasn't really a member, so I didn't know the operation. So I embarked on creating a co-op. And I must say the co-op model and the format of the co-op and land sharing just fits together like a glove. It's perfect. And so we created what's called the Healthy Living Community Co-operative, and it's creating an eco-village in Northern Rivers. We have approval for 65 homes. So yeah, if people don't know anything in the background of land sharing cooperatives, they are a movement since the 70s. They came out of the 70s when people were wanting to live on the land, and a lot of cooperatives were created then. Unfortunately, it kind of died down in the 80s and 90s. I think it's probably the lawyer influence. Lawyers aren't very familiar with cooperatives, and so they recommended to create companies. So a lot of communities now are companies, and so we're quite a new re-emergence of the land sharing co-op. And yeah, so there's quite a lot of co-ops around. If people haven't heard of them, some of them have 100 houses or so. Run schools, and a very complex environment, I must say. So I'll just skip through. So yeah, the Healthy Living Community Co-op, we have 30 members. We own 700 acres, and we actually own a primary school as well, and have a number of other buildings because the land we bought was an old village. So we're in the process of recreating a village that once was there. There was a general store there, and there's plans to build a new one. So it's quite an exciting re-inhabiting the village kind of movement. And this time, rather than the 70s, we're going in with the eyes wide open. And thanks to all of you that have, embarking on the co-op, we're learning what's the best ways to operate and manage, whereas I think in the 70s it was a little bit loose. And it's been a really interesting journey, and it is providing affordable housing for these people, but I guess the alternative of people that want to live closer to land in a more rural environment that may, that don't want to necessarily live in the city and that want to sort of, I guess, coordinate and live together. So yeah, we have a school. The co-op is actually thinking of creating a microgrid. Well, it actually is going to create a microgrid. So the co-op is also going to be an energy provider, as well as wastewater, and basically a whole service provider. So the co-op's going to be quite a complex as it goes on, managing quite a lot of aspects. It's quite nice. The members just walking around the land, sharing dreams together about how they build. And the unique aspect of this co-op as well is there's people like myself, professionals that have come in and assisted these group of people that may not have known what it's like to be on the board of a co-op or manage. And so we've done a lot in 2 years. Probably people in the process might think it's going slow, but when I look outside, I'm like, no, we're really going fast. And people are already talking about, when are you going to do the next one? And I'm like, I'll just wait a little bit longer. So what's worked, as I was saying, what's worked is having professionals like myself assisting in the formation of the co-op. But knowing how these communities have worked in the past, making sure that it's sustainable, it needs to be a succession, so I can step away and others professionals can step away and the co-op manages itself. So we're in that process right now. We also organise workshops for the members. What does it take to live together? What does it take to make decisions, governance? What does it take to be in a co-op? And part of that is actually the decision making, so the board make day-to-day decisions, but the community itself has been involved in the village design. So when there's big decisions that need to be made, the community itself gets involved and makes those decisions. And that's worked really well because there's a sense of ownership by all the members that this is their village. I guess the professional aspect has helped as well because these are members that maybe I don't have any experience working with government or bureaucracy, and so it's been really helpful to have that interface. If they had gone themselves to some of these organisations, they would have been a bit bamboozled, I think. And the great thing about the co-op, of course, we can adopt policies. So if there's a rule, some of the co-op rules, okay, we need to create a policy about that, and that can be adopted. So having the co-op as a backbone has been a real helpful process in the whole creation of the village. That's one of the workshops we did. What hasn't worked? I guess some of the things that haven't worked is, the board taking on the responsibility of what is the $6 million project, and even though I'm there to help and others are there to help, it's at the end of the day they have to make the decisions, and so that's been a learning curve, and there's some ways we could have done that better. The long time frames needed sometimes to make these decisions, even though it has been great, the members being involved in the village design, it's also prolonged a lot of the processes. So it's a two-edged sword in that way. Also the founders, as all these communities start, there's always differing values and sorting out at the start, and that's been an interesting process, whereas if we had a clearer sort of vision at the beginning, I think it probably would have gone a bit smoother. And I guess the biggest issue is one that I think we'll touch on, is funding and finance. And even though it is very affordable, so as a collective, with 65 homes, we can make it very affordable for people to buy in. However, building and all those things, shares in a co-op is not seen by a financial institution as your home, and so therefore there's a lot of barriers about accessing finance and how people can build. So that's been one thing we are tackling and workshopping as a co-op at the moment. But it's an amazing journey, and I'd like to think that we've progressed from the 70s, and thinking of the debate, we're looking at a new way of forming a land sharing co-op that is different from a group of friends getting together and going, what do we do now, kind of thing. This is, people from the outside have noticed how fast we're going, and also how professional, I guess, we are forming as a group. And it's really nice to see all the members stepping up, learning to drive tractors, but also learning to be a board member or chairperson on a large co-op. So it's a learning journey, and hopefully if there's going to be a next one, we can learn from this one as well.
1 minute, John.
Some of the things to consider, I guess one of the issues when we decided to form as a co-op, we did it as a for-profit. I'm now thinking that maybe we should be in a non-for-profit, because the shares themselves we're not necessarily selling for profit. So we could have possibly been a non-for-profit, and that would have we operate pretty much as a non-for-profit, with all the profits going back into the project anyway. So that's maybe something to consider. As I mentioned before, the board members are volunteers, and so it is a very big responsibility, and with limited funds, it's hard to get that professionality amongst the board. We've just hired a co-op manager, which is really helpful, and maybe that should have been done earlier. And financial assistance, as I said before. We're working on workshopping on this, and one of the ways is looking at leases for people, for the sites, their home sites. So as a member, you get a home site.
That's our time.
And we're looking at leases as a possible way to get finance. I've got lots more to share, but that's quickly.
Thank you very much, Shane. Excellent presentation, very engaging, and it did make me want to move to the Northern Rivers. Now we're going to complete our trio of wonderful speakers and invite Sidsel to come to the lectern. Thank you.
Hello. Yes, I'm here to talk about potentialities. My name is Sidsel Grimstad. I'm an adjunct at the Griffith Business School, and I have been researching housing cooperatives the last 5 years. And last year I was able to lead and curate a study tour to Europe for what we called you, the group, and I'm looking at Liz because she was part of the study tour, Australian decision makers in the housing sector, to try to what should I say, unpack a few myths about what housing co-ops are, and also to understand how the countries in Europe fund large sectors of housing co-ops. And last, we wanted to also explore innovation in the housing sector, because, and I think this was really interesting with Shane, you said, there was this soft organization of housing co-ops in the Northern Rivers, and this myth about housing co-ops being very soft and airy-fairy, I think, permeates Australia to a large extent. So we want to kind of put another image of what housing co-ops can be. Yes, and I titled it Affordable Housing Cooperatives Build Better Societies, and that's what I want to talk about. Next, yes. The scale of affordable housing co-ops in Europe, in many countries, is extraordinary. In Australia, we have less than 1%, as you said. In Denmark, Austria, and Switzerland, it's nationally between 20% and 5% in Switzerland, but Zurich is 18%. So the substantial part of the housing stock is affordable rental housing co-ops. What does it do to cities? It does enormous amounts to improve the well-being of the whole population in cities, because there is access to decent housing and secure housing. It also reduces insecurities of housing, and this leads to economic mobility, like Liz, you talked about. Your coming into a safe house creates economic mobility. And the last two elements, I think, is that it improves environmental sustainability, because it is tenant-led and tenant focused. Tenants want more sustainable housing. Tenants want more. They want, of course, affordable and secure housing, but they want more. They want community building housing. And the last thing I think is really important, and what we found, is that housing co-ops can be so many things. It can be from Shane's model of rural land cooperative to co-ops that we saw in Vienna of thousands of flats together. And there's this enormous spectrum between these different models. So the last myth of co-ops is that it's inflexible and rigid. No, it's not. It's very agile, and it responds to demand in society. I want to quickly, because I think my time is running. Yes, okay. I wanted to say a few quick things about funding. How have these three countries been able to build or fund cooperative housing, which in the Australian kind of imaginary is not financially viable. But what we see in both Zurich and in Copenhagen is that we get collaborative funding models. We see a mix of funding, and the mix of funding from different sources. It can be some government funding. It's primarily commercial or banks funding it, but there's also solidarity funds. And there's a bit of equity. Even though it's rental co-ops, it's also a bit of equity. And this creates risk-sharing models, which then is more acceptable for commercial funding. We also found that in the Danish funding model, for instance, they have a very long perspective on how to not only fund individual co-ops, but how to accumulate funds so that you can build co-ops in perpetuity going forward. They have a 50-year perspective on this. The first 30 years, they pay back their debt with the rent, and the rent is affordable. Let's not forget, it's affordable and adjusted to your income. The next 10 years, they pay back some kind of state debt because they've received subsidies. And then the next 20 years, 10, 15, 20 years, they replenish the National Building Fund, they replenish the Co-ops Fund, and they replenish the Co-op Federation, Housing Federation Fund. So this means over time they build funding in perpetuity. The National Housing Building Fund in Denmark can be used as a guarantor for then attracting more fund, of course. So these are the models that we need to start exploring, I think, in Australia. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through the next couple of slides because I want to show that there is so much innovation in co-op housing in Europe. Zurich, we found a big complex of flats, almost 100 flats, built on top of a tram station. And why? Because that's where public transport, you can't be more central than that. And a lot of people don't have access to cars and parking and so on. This is perfect. And the city of Zurich then provides cheaper land in order to develop these areas that are suitable for low-income families. In Denmark, we've an experimental housing complex called the Red Thread had intergenerational housing. So they had the pensioners on the top, families in the middle, and then students, and then common areas on the bottom of the house. And so they were working on the intergenerational collaboration between there. We see also trying to understand how you can make housing slightly cheaper by going through modular housing. We saw different models of that in Denmark. Denmark is very much a leader when it comes to sustainable housing. They make it almost a national pride to develop models that are carbon zero and positive buildings. So the building to the left is a carbon positive build of modules. To the right, we have a housing that is a mix of recent young refugee immigrants, mixed with students who want to support them in integrating into society. Also, housing according to need and well-being. I think there's a huge, bigger focus on what is actually the need. To the left in Vienna, they have started experimenting with very small flats, but then build common areas like these balconies, one for bike storage and the other for just social being, and with more parks around them. Smaller flats, but more common areas. But in a big way, in a sense, not in a smaller land. To the right, we have Zurich, Meralsvon, which is a quite substantial flat area of 13,000 flats, but a huge focus on offering different types of housing. They had cluster flats where you could elect to be more cooperative, more live closer together, or individual flats, and all within the same area. So the diversity of choice is extraordinary, and large areas of non-car areas, play areas, and also employment opportunities.
You're out of time.
And that's I'm just out of time now because I want to just market the report that we wrote.
Thank you very much. I think you'll agree with me that this has been a wonderful set of presentations. I thank the presenters for being timely, but I also thank them for the quality of their presentations has been so informative. It's like the tour you wish you could have about cooperative housing in Australia and internationally. We had three very different perspectives. Now, I'm told that there's the opportunity to ask questions and vote on questions through Slido. But in the meantime, I will take the chair's prerogative and ask the first question. And I believe all of you are mic'd up? No? No. We have this, the other technology. Working? So, one of the themes I picked up in the presentations was the importance of finance. And you're right, there is a myth that it's very hard to gain finance for affordable housing. Who would like to perhaps be the first person to talk about finance for cooperative housing in Australia? Liz, would you mind going first?
I think one of the points with co-op housing, and we've been reflecting on this as an organisation, we don't need more people who want to live in co-op housing because we actually cut off our wait list so we have a reasonable expectation of housing people on the wait list. Given that people join a co-op and generally stay there for life, and I showed you those duration of tenure, so around 11 to 14 up to 40 years. Until someone moves out of a property, there's not an opportunity for someone to move in. So in order to meet the demand for co-op housing, which exists, we need more co-op housing. There are two things working against that for us in the co-op housing sector. One is that HAF, which I think the Housing Australia Future Fund, which has received lots of kudos, and it's a great thing, but primarily I have never seen so much testosterone in the community housing sector since the day I joined it, and it is suddenly property developers courting charities to access government funding to do developments, and the government's been really clear, we want scale and we want delivery quickly. So when you're talking about scale of 100 unit developments, 120 unit developments, they are really hard to deliver when you've got 8 weeks to fill in an application form for the funding. So one of the things Arch is doing is lobbying the Minister to ensure that we want a dedicated stream of Housing Australia Future Fund funding to build cooperative housing up to 10% of Australia's social housing stock. And that just has to be rinse and repeat that message. We need a dedicated fund, a dedicated stream of funding, because that's how the market got established. The other thing working against us is that the days of receiving capital grants to build community housing have gone. It's now about co-contribution payments and the housing provider bearing the risk of the debt in order to build the housing. So with HAF, you get 30-year co-contribution payments, which are designed to help you repay the capital and interest of the loan. But banks will only lend you up to 10 or 15 years at a time. So as the housing provider, you need a crystal ball to actually determine what risk are you prepared to run about interest rates in 15 years' time when you're going to have to refinance the institutional debt you need in order to qualify for the HAF funding. Institutions want liquidity, which means they don't have a 50-year horizon like we saw in Europe. They have a 10-year horizon, and they want return on investment. Well, when you're charging income-based rent, that's not possible to give them the rate of investment they can get in the open market. So I think we just have to, if we're serious, we have to rethink the institutional approach to lending money for cooperative housing, because the current paradigm, it's just not going to work to help us build co-op housing stock. And that's from an organisation with a $1.2 billion balance sheet and only 65 million debt against it. We've got a lazy balance sheet. We want to access it, but we can't within the current financial institution market.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. In the pre-session briefing, Sidsel and Liz did point out to me that there would be a lot of discussion, and looking at Slido, it's clearly the case.
You wouldn't need your Dorothy Dixon.
Well, I did ask one of them, didn't I? Let's address the first question that's on the Slido list at the moment. What about housing co-ops of people that are not social affordable housing eligible? Do you believe it's possible in Australia? I might throw that to you first, Sidsel, if you don't mind.
It's sometimes very hard to explain what housing cooperatives are in Australia. But if I say, for not in the social housing sector, but for equity-based housing co-ops, I say it's like strata title, and then everybody says, okay. But isn't there a lot of trouble in the strata? But housing co-ops creates a lot of trouble. And I said, well, it does so in the strata title also. But the difference between a equity-based housing co-op and a strata title is that there is a federation around it that can support you, mediate problems without contacting your lawyers and going through the courts. And I think that is a really, really important element. That wasn't the answer to the question. But, so yes, well, equity-based co-ops are very prominent in many countries in Europe. I mean, the statistics I showed you earlier was only about rental co-ops. In Norway, for instance, we have 40% of Oslo are equity-based co-ops, where you have equity in there. Can it work in Australia? I think, again, that of course it can work in Australia, but again, it comes back to finance and funding. And I think some of the banks are very strictly regulated or very risk averse. They don't want to fund equity-based co-ops.
Great, thank you. Shane, you have lived experience of this. Could you share that?
Yeah, I mean, look, we are creating a co-op that is available to anyone. And there is there's example of rural co-ops, but there's no reason why this can't be also applied in urban environments. And that's the thing about co-ops, it's the collective buying power. So using that collective buying power, one of the things we're looking at in our co-op is using the collective equity that the co-op owns to help because we can't access normal, if individuals can't access normal finance, maybe as a co-op as a whole we can, and lend that to members. So there's a whole lot of creative things that come out of co-ops. It's more about the will. If there's a will, there's a way, and the co-op is one of the ways to help that. So it's more about actually, I would say, it is possible, but you need to get a group of like-minded people around you, and that's probably the key of any co-op. But yeah, I think it's definitely possible. It's just as you said, there's this thought, oh no, we can't do that, there's going to be issues, but there's issues in strata title, there's issues with your neighbour anyway. It's not going to change the issues. In fact, you have a better platform, you have co-op rules around and the federation to support you rather than legal or council trying to arbitrate between you and the neighbour.
Thanks, Shane. We now move on to the next question on my Slido list, which is, what were the governmental frameworks in Europe that facilitated cooperative housing? I wonder who I asked that question of. Maybe Sidsel, you go first.
That facilitated, okay. I mean, these, first of all, especially the co-op sector in Denmark and in Vienna, or Copenhagen and Vienna, they are based on more than 100-year tradition, and a history of providing affordable housing to their population. It's not a, what should I say? That's why they are also, among the world's most livable cities, I would say. But so that's one thing, a dedication, like a commitment to providing affordable housing everywhere in the city. So avoiding, very high, so affordable housing in every suburb in the city. So that's a planning element, and it's also commitment. Interestingly, in Switzerland and in Zurich, they have housing as a human right in their constitution. Zurich, Switzerland, it's quite surprising that it has a large housing co-op sector because Switzerland is so high cost. But they found out in Zurich, if they didn't build affordable housing in Zurich, they didn't have workers to increase their economy, to grow their economy. Everybody can't be bankers and earn €1 million. So they had to find a way to house essential workers and just to make the society work. And that was the start of the co-op housing sector in Zurich. And it's quite recent. It started comparably recent in the 90s. And that was a dedication by the Zurich City Council saying, we need this, otherwise this city is going downhill. It will die because we don't have people coming to live here. So, and I would also, of course, point to the financing models. And these financing frameworks and models have been developed over time. And there are, I'm not a banker or a financier, but there are underlying mechanisms that support a flexible financing model of new projects in all these 3 cities that we visited. The Danish model, also the National Building Fund was also established late in the 90s, I think. So it's not like it's been there forever. So don't give up, you got to start somewhere. But I think it is about the commitment and also responding to a desperate need. And I do think Sydney and the big cities in Australia definitely has come to that point now.
Liz, I might turn that around and ask, what governmental frameworks would you like to facilitate the growth of cooperative housing in Australia? Clearly there's varied experience in Europe, but what would you like in Australia?
Well, I think just adding to what Sidsel said, what we saw in Europe and what we need to see in Australia, where housing alongside health and education is a not negotiable third pillar of what we expect our governments to deliver. And somehow in Australia we've slipped into this idea that housing insecurity is a fact of life, and so is homelessness. And one of the things, Sidsel, if you recall, we visited 4 European cities that we saw 5 homeless people. That was over nearly 3 weeks. Across 4 European cities, we saw 5 people living on the streets. And that just really shocked me because in Melbourne, in Sydney, we just consider it's now a fact of life, and somehow those people don't want to be housed or they're too hard to house. I think in order to grow co-op housing, we need there to be a government, it needs to be recognised within the continuum of housing. At the moment, we talk about public housing, we talk about social housing, then there's private rental, then there's home ownership. We have to see co-op housing as different to community housing. One of the other things that worked in Europe that we saw, Sidsel, was the financial stack. The financial stack of some co-op housing providers was made up of tenant contributions that were sometimes up to $100,000, $150,000 to live in a co-op. What people were buying was housing security, and then that went into the capital stack for the developer to develop more housing. And if you just let go of home ownership is the only way you can have housing security, and we start acknowledging there's a need for a different paradigm. The government hasn't had to consider it to date because home ownership has always been an option, and there's still that driving, I think, if you see it in the government policies, let's just talk about home ownership. No government wants to say, we're actually going to acknowledge home ownership is not an option for everybody now, and we're going to have a different policy. And I think it's up to us to demand something different, but I think they have to acknowledge co-op housing is financially sustainable. it's commercially viable, and it is what people want. And I think this next generation coming through don't necessarily want home ownership. What we saw, and I'm from Tasmania, and I now know why Mary married Fred, because the Danes have just got everything right, and that's why they're so bloody smug. Because, you know, what we saw in Denmark was the quality of living is greater because young people aren't spending 65, 70% of their disposal income on their housing. They're going out and doing what young people should. So it's up to us to just, I think, pop that bubble of home ownership and think about that paradigm. But I just want to say, in terms of, someone said earlier, you've got to influence your politicians. Well, I did exactly that when Claire O'Neill was appointed Housing Minister. I immediately looked up what co-ops I had in her area and issued an invitation to come and visit our Polish co-op, which is one of our really successful co-ops. She came and met a wonderful young couple older couple, who'd immigrated from Poland. They arrived in Australia in their early 50s with $60,000 in the bank. They had too much to qualify for public housing. They were too old to get a housing loan. So they stayed in the private rental market until they ran out of money. And then they came into a housing co-op, and I could have kissed him when he said to the minister, I walked through that door and the weight of 100 years fell from my shoulders. 2 weeks later, she rang, her minder rang and said, the minister wants to come back and bring Jim Chalmers to visit one of your other co-ops. So I think there's an interest. We need to convert that to an appetite. Thanks.
I forgot one of the most important elements in the European sector is strong co-op federations, strong co-op support structures that can both advocate and support mediation in the co-ops and development of co-ops. And they are strong, they are big and they are strong. And they help the co-op members and they advocate strongly towards politicians. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Our top question is around the building of the new city around the airport at Badgerys Creek, and asks whether there's a bid for inclusive housing and inclusive development as part of that new build. Now, to the best of my knowledge, none of you lives in Sydney, but I think many of you might have a very important perspective to share about inclusive development overall. Shane, over to you.
As I've got a town planning background, I can say that from the planning framework, this is where I think the planning framework needs to also reform to include more of this. Because, like the question before, in an urban environment, you're up against, of course, developers, and so a collective, it's very hard to compete. So it'd be great if the planning framework could actually specify, areas set aside for cooperative housing. Why not just straight out cooperative housing, because that's guaranteed to be affordable and inclusive. So it's a good way that the government can reassure that that's going to be used for its purpose if it actually says it has to be cooperative housing. So as a planner, I'd love to see that.
One of the embryonic conversations I'm having at the moment is with an American institutional investor who's investing in build-to-rent housing in Australia, and that build-to-rent market end of the model only stacks up financially if they can charge 10 to 20% above the market rent of the property. It's the concierge and fluffy towels model. So when you hear build-to-rent by private developers, they're not talking about affordable housing. They're talking about pitching to that end of the market. But the developers know that if they include an element of social housing in their development, they'll get it more favourable consideration from some councils. And some councils, to their credit, are now insisting on it. The strength we can play to is that cooperative housing is a much more palatable option for your social housing element. So taking what we saw in Vienna, he's doing like squillion dollar worth of 20 levels of development. I said, I can take 2 levels of that development and make it a housing cooperative. And so for him, his response was, I'd rather not have housos, it was his way of it. But if that's what we're playing with, let's give them an alternative. And so I'm pitching the idea of an elders co-op within that development, that we can purchase 2 levels of that and turn it into a co-op. So I think it's not going to change overnight, but we're going to have to work with what we've got while we build that momentum.
Yeah, back to also Vienna, where we visited a huge area which was on a shut down airport. They had actually dedicated developments for what they call community housing, which is more inclusive housing, so affordable housing, and then commercial housing. And they had different land prices accordingly. And community housing was self-organized from, communities, whereas affordable housing isn't necessarily self-organized, but is still co-op housing. So it's interesting that there is definitely possible to offer different models also in new big developments. Just needs a bit more open mind.
Thank you very much. I think I might go out of order and ask a question which I think is fascinating. What happens with kids that grow up in cooperative housing? I think short answers, please, on this one.
My kids are growing up on a community co-op kind of housing. They have a lot of fun. But yeah, I think maybe the question around that is around equity in terms of inheritance. And yes, it's not a growing equity case, but I kind of like to think that at least to have a home to come back to, and they had a more broader childhood, and they have the security of the family home still. So even though it's not building equity maybe as much as the free market, there's still that security.
A study by the University of Western Sydney that released last year, one of their findings was that the benefits of living in a co-op extended not only to the co-op members but the children of families living in co-ops, because they had stable education environments and they had a stable living environment. So there's actually proof around that. The issue of intergenerational co-op becomes challenging when it relates to the same house, because the co-op in our organisation, if a co-op family home has 3 or 4 bedrooms and there's one person living in it because they've inherited that becomes problematic. But having said that, I've got a couple of families where we're now 3rd generation co-op housing members, but they've lived within different houses within the co-op.
I don't have much to add other than in Vienna, children can inherit the co-op house, so that you can have the intergenerational inheritance within the co-op. Yeah.
It's the same with our co-ops, you can inherit it, but also we also have a fast-track process for any of the children that want to become members. So we have a separate process for them to become members of the co-op, so it's easier than an outsider person.
What a great range of responses. I'm going to cobble together the next question with one I saw earlier in this session, and that is, can you talk about the relationship between housing cooperatives and mutual housing finance? Are the mutuals actually involved in the sector? And also, how can co-ops and mutual financial institutions work together to deliver affordable housing? Liz, you seem to be a volunteer.
Well, it's a hot topic for us right now. I spoke at the Business Council of Co-op and Mutuals CEO Forum in Perth late last year, and that's what I talked about. You're all talking about we want to do more about affordable housing, but we have a principle of cooperation amongst cooperatives. So why aren't you talking to us about cooperative housing? Why are you even wondering what you need to do about this? The thing is, with the co-op and mutual financial institutions that are They are governed by the same financial regulations and complexities of the banks. The way that some of them are doing it, if they're really creative, is by creating foundations off the side of their main enterprise. So if they have a charitable foundation as part of their NRMA, as part of their Bank Australia, they can fund co-ops through that arm of the business. But co-ops and mutuals, there should be more a synergy, but they get caught up in that same financial regulation. And for super funds, superannuation trustees have a personal liability of ensuring they maximise the return to investors. And so they say that investing in cooperative housing that isn't charging market rate rent doesn't give the best rate of their return to investors. My response to that is, why don't you set up an investment vehicle within your super fund for people to invest in affordable housing? And that's my final point about the European tour. In Europe, no one talked about community housing or social housing. It was only a discussion about affordable housing and how many ways could you deliver it.
Yeah, and I think I mean the banks, the commercial funding of housing in Europe was commercial funding. There was no they looked at profit in the lending terms there, but it's about risk sharing, I think, and finding kind of collaborative financing models where we have a bit of equity, we have maybe some solidarity funds, we have different types of funding, and then the commercial banks, or whether they're mutual or... Yeah, some of it was underwritten, not all of it, no. But it's about finding a kind of this collaborative funding model where the risk is shared and where you can kind of accept the terms of that.
Sure. Would you mind standing up? It would make it easier for people to hear you.
What's coming across to me from some of what's being said is that actually governments here, or governments, do not understand correctly the value stack of collaborative housing. Because
Microphone? Yeah.
if you're creating giving people secure living conditions, you're changing quite a few parameters. You're changing their health outcomes, and therefore how much they're interacting with the health system. You're changing their ability to get employment, and therefore how much they're paying in tax. You're changing their kids' educational outcomes, all of which has economic impacts. It would be wonderful to see some studies on the economic impacts, because then you can go back to government and say, hey, we're creating a stack of value for you, so how about you get off your bum and empower the creative financing, because you're getting a return on that investment anyway, even if it's not obvious in the dollar terms. You're getting it in educational outcomes, you're getting it in tax, and you're getting it in health. Sorry.
Thank you.
The University of Western Sydney study actually did look at the economic benefits of co-ops and proved that co-op housing is marginally cheaper, just marginally cheaper than traditional models of community housing, but when the non-cash benefits are considered, it delivers infinitely more. So the study's already been done, the results just haven't really been taken up.
We might take that to after the session. Thank you.
Just quickly on that as well, living in the Northern Rivers, I've been through quite a few natural disasters already in the last 5 years. And one of the interesting outcomes is from bushfires to floods, that the land sharing communities actually were the first responders often to these disasters and had treated them effectively and cared for the community. And so these land sharing communities actually make the community a whole lot more resilient.
Great point. We now have more questions than we can possibly answer in the time available to us, and I have a feeling that this session could go for another 2 hours potentially, but unfortunately it can't, or Peter would shoot me. One of the questions asks, how can the UN lobby governments for cooperative housing? And I'd like to tie that with another question we had earlier about what should this sector and what should we as individuals be doing to promote the cause of cooperative housing in Australia? Liz, would you mind going first?
Hello. I think that this is the International Year of Cooperatives, and how the UN can help is to start asking questions about the Australian of the government. What is their position on cooperative housing? What are they doing to encourage that development? I think that's really important. What was the second part of the question?
And what can we be doing?
Well,
what can the sector be doing, and what can we as individuals do?
Politicians are driven by what people want and what people ask for. So I think what concerns me about HAF, people are saying we need more housing, so the government are going to build more housing. It's not just building more housing, it's how that housing is managed once it's built. That's the important question that makes life-changing differences to people. I think everybody just has to start asking those questions about their local politicians and asking those questions in open forums. We're working to develop, for the first time for this federal election, Archer will have a policy statement and be asking each of the parties what their policies are in relation to cooperative housing. But, Archer is 4 CEOs running it off the side of their desk. We really, I think, need to be part of that bigger co-op movement and demanding governments have a response to it, and it's not something that they don't know about.
I think this housing crisis is so large that the government needs to be creative, and part of that is, hey, here's some funds. There's questions here about NDIS, aged care, cooperatives. This is still really new stuff in Australia, maybe not overseas, but it's new stuff here, and we can learn from overseas. And the government should be putting money. All right, let's put some money into this and see how it works as a model. And so they should be funding these co-op models on different types of housing. That's what I think.
One of the questions in front of us asks, how can we transition from voluntary to professionally managed cooperatives and source the initial investment, and I think by implication also manage the stock? Is this something we should be looking towards? And if so, how will we do it? Sidsel, would you mind going first?
Well, I think co-ops and what we've seen overseas is that they are supported by co-op federations, co-op ARCHA, BCCM, and so on. And I think we can lean on them and ask for their help into how to professionalize management of co-ops. I think there is certainly knowledge and competence here in Australia, but I mean, as you also said, that you are very small organizations and you are really working very hard to support the co-op sector. Yeah, I think that's really important. I think lobbying for more housing co-ops is important to the local environment. So using your local councils and lobbying there is for everybody to do. Yeah.
I think the important thing, though, is that all housing cooperatives, no matter the model, ensure they have really strong governance frameworks, because that is how we do refute, and that is one of the criticisms of co-op housing by larger community housing providers. Why would you trust millions and millions of dollars worth of assets to a group of volunteers? And that's why, at CEHL we developed a 20-scale governance models that all of our co-ops develop, and it's very clear and transparent, and we have red, amber and green lights for things. So whatever works for your model, but it is a professional service, whether it's delivered by professionals. And what we saw in Europe was the housing, the tenants, the members actually engaged the housing provider, which really flipped that power imbalance. But professionalism in how we manage co-op housing portfolios is absolutely critical if we want to grow, because that whole thing, it's a bunch of hippies who are volunteering to manage property. It's not safe, it's high risk. We need to be able to counter that.
Thank you.
And I just want to quickly say, and that's got definitely the stigma with land sharing communities is the hippie thing. But the reality is they actually worked. You know, it was a policy in the 70s for affordable housing, environmentally friendly, with all new things. And it actually, one of the few planning policies that actually worked, and it's not been celebrated that it actually worked. So it's a shame that all that negativity is put on these models, but they're actually working.
So we're almost out of time, and I think I'll finish off by asking each of the panellists to share one last thought before we come to a close.
I see some of this work as myth-busting, and I think we can only continue down that line, but also continue with the evidence that both the ARC project of Australian housing co-ops have provided, to argue the case for housing co-ops going forward. I think that's just such a strong case, and especially in this housing crisis. We need more models, and we need more flexibility and open-mindedness. And we need also maybe more experimentation, because housing is, I find it a very rigid perspective in Australia. There are so many more models out there, and maybe experimentation, having more experimentation is a good way forward.
I think just that continuing to promote co-op housing as a viable part of the Australian housing landscape. We did an interview on Radio National on Monday. You can find it on the Archer website, where there was a researcher, a co-op member, and I talking about co-op housing. The fact we got half an hour on Radio National, I think, is terrific. But it is about continuing to rewrite the stories of the 70s and promote the success we're having right now.
Yeah, I guess it's, as you're saying, it's about, I think the co-op has the answer. Like the government's saying we need more social housing that's environmentally friendly, that's more participatory. The co-op model is the answer to that. So whenever that question's asked by the government, if there's someone there to say, well, that's co-op housing, then hopefully that message will get across eventually.
Thank you very much. We are right on time. Please join me in thanking three excellent panellists. Don't go just yet. I need to heap more praise on you. I don't think you could get a better set of presentations on cooperative housing anywhere in the world. And to be able to apply this depth of knowledge to such a complex problem and point towards solutions really is a gift that many of us should be grateful for. So thank you very much. And with that, I think we have a 15-minute break.